The year was 1884, and the dusty streets of Tombstone, Arizona Territory buzzed with whispers that would soon turn into the most scandalous tale the frontier had ever witnessed. What started as a simple cowboy's decision would unravel secrets buried deeper than any gold mine in the Superstition Mountains, and reveal a truth so shocking that it would shake the very foundations of everything the townspeople believed they knew about honor, love, and betrayal in the unforgiving American West. Hook 1. Little did anyone know that the beautiful indigenous woman Jake Morrison chose over the wealthy rancher's daughter wasn't just any ordinary tribal member. She was the key to a conspiracy that had been 20 years in the making, one that involved stolen land, murdered families, and a web of lies that reached all the way to the territorial governor's mansion. The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Tombstone when Jake Morrison made the decision that would change his life forever. Standing outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, dust swirling around his weathered boots, he watched as Margaret Whitman, daughter of the most powerful cattle baron in all of Arizona Territory, approached him with tears streaming down her face. Her father, Big Bill Whitman, owned more than 50,000 acres of prime grazing land and commanded respect from every cowhand, sheriff, and businessman from Phoenix to Tucson. Margaret was everything a frontier man could want: beautiful, educated back east, and heir to a fortune that could set a man up for life. But Jake's heart belonged elsewhere, to a woman the other cowboys whispered about with a mixture of fear and disgust. Ayanna was her name, though most of the white settlers refused to use it, calling her simply the Apache woman when they spoke of her at all. She lived on the outskirts of town in a small adobe house that her grandfather had built before the white man's law claimed these lands. Her skin was the color of desert sand at sunset, her hair black as a moonless night, and her eyes held secrets that went deeper than the copper mines that scarred the nearby mountains. The cowboys at the local ranches sneered when they saw Jake riding toward her home, shaking their heads at what they saw as his foolish infatuation with a woman they considered beneath any respectable white man. What none of them knew, what Jake himself was only beginning to suspect, was that Ayanna carried within her the truth about events that had transpired 2 decades earlier, events that had shaped the very landscape of territorial politics and land ownership in ways that would terrify the powerful men who controlled Arizona's destiny. Her grandfather hadn't just built that adobe house. He had witnessed something that certain people had killed to keep secret, and now his granddaughter was the only living person who knew the location of evidence that could destroy lives and topple empires. The story truly began on a cold November morning in 1864, when a wagon train carrying surveyors from the territorial government had disappeared without a trace somewhere between the Dragoon Mountains and the town of Bisbee. Official reports claimed that Apache raiders had attacked the convoy, killing all 12 men and making off with the surveying equipment and government documents they carried. The incident was quickly buried in bureaucratic paperwork, just another tragic example of the dangers faced by those brave enough to map the wild territories for future development. But Ayanna's grandfather, a man named Nailnish who worked as a tracker for the army, had been in those mountains that day, and what he saw was not Apache warriors attacking white surveyors. Instead, he witnessed something far more sinister: a carefully orchestrated ambush carried out by white men dressed as Apache warriors, men who spoke English as they methodically executed the surveyors and seized the documents they carried. These weren't random killers or desperados looking for easy money. They moved with military precision, and their leader was a man Nailnish recognized from his visits to the fort, a man who would later become one of the most powerful landowners in the territory, a man whose wealth and influence grew mysteriously after that bloody November day. Hook 2. The murdered surveyors weren't just mapping land for the government. They were carrying proof that some of the biggest ranches in Arizona Territory, including the Whitman spread, had been built on fraudulently claimed ground, stolen not from the Apache but from Mexican families who held legitimate land grants dating back to before the war with Mexico, documents that proved certain powerful men were nothing more than thieves and killers hiding behind badges and business suits. For 20 years, Nailnish kept this terrible secret, watching as the men responsible for the massacre built fortunes on blood and lies. He taught his granddaughter the location of the hidden cache where he had buried the evidence he collected from the murder scene: military buttons torn from uniforms, personal items dropped by the killers, and most importantly, a small leather journal belonging to the lead surveyor that contained names, dates, and detailed descriptions of the fraudulent land claims that certain powerful men had been covering up through murder and intimidation. Jake Morrison knew none of this when he first encountered Ayanna at the trading post in Dragoon Springs 6 months earlier. He had been driving cattle through the mountain passes when his horse threw a shoe, forcing him to stop at the small settlement for repairs. She was there buying supplies, her English perfect despite what the townspeople claimed about savages, not being able to learn civilized language. There was something about her bearing, the way she carried herself with quiet dignity despite the hostile stares of the other customers, that drew Jake's attention. When one of his fellow cowboys made a crude comment about pretty squaws, Jake found himself stepping forward, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol at his hip. The confrontation that followed earned Jake the scorn of his coworkers and the attention of Ayanna herself. She approached him later, as he waited for the blacksmith to finish shoeing his horse, and thanked him for his intervention. Her voice was soft but strong, educated in a way that surprised him, and when she looked into his eyes, he felt something he had never experienced with any of the dance hall girls or ranchers' daughters he had known before. There was intelligence there, and pain, and something else, a weight of knowledge that seemed too heavy for someone so young to carry. Their courtship was conducted in secret, meeting in hidden canyons and secluded valleys where the disapproving eyes of Tombstone citizens couldn't find them. Ayanna told him stories of her people's history, of the time before the white man's arrival, when her ancestors had lived in harmony with the harsh beauty of the desert landscape. She spoke of her grandfather, who had worked as a scout for the army until his health failed, and who now spent his days carving traditional figures from desert wood and sharing ancient stories with his granddaughter. Jake, in turn, told her about his own past, how he had come west after the war, seeking a new start far from the blood-soaked battlefields of Virginia and Tennessee. But as their relationship deepened, Jake began to notice things that troubled him. Other cowboys would fall silent when he entered the bunkhouse, their conversations dying mid-sentence as if they had been discussing something they didn't want him to hear. At the saloon, men who had been friendly before now watched him with suspicious eyes, and more than once he caught fragments of whispered conversations about traders and Indian lovers, and what happened to white men who forgot their place in the natural order of things. The tension came to a head on the night of the territorial governor's visit to Tombstone. A grand celebration had been planned, with all the important ranchers and businessmen gathering at the Cosmopolitan Hotel to discuss the future of Arizona Territory and its eventual statehood. Jake had been invited as one of Big Bill Whitman's top hands, and Margaret had made it clear that she expected him to escort her to the festivities. It was to be their public debut as a couple, the first step toward an engagement that would unite two of the most prominent families in the region. But Jake never made it to the hotel that night. As he was preparing to leave the bunkhouse, cleaned up and wearing his best clothes, a small Apache boy appeared at the window with an urgent message from Ayanna. Her grandfather was dying, and he needed to speak with Jake immediately about matters of life and death that could not wait for morning. Without hesitation, Jake abandoned his plans for the evening and rode hard through the darkness toward the small adobe house on the outskirts of town. He found Nailnish propped up in his bed, his weathered face pale but his eyes still sharp with intelligence and purpose. Ayanna sat beside him, tears streaming down her face as she held her grandfather's hand. In halting English mixed with Spanish and Apache phrases, the old man began to tell Jake a story that would change everything he thought he knew about the powerful men who controlled the territory. The Surveyor Massacre of 1864 was just the beginning, Nailnish explained through labored breathing. The documents those men had been carrying contained evidence of a vast conspiracy involving fraudulent land claims, bribery of territorial officials, and the systematic murder of Mexican families who held legitimate grants to millions of acres of prime grazing and mining land. Big Bill Whitman wasn't just a successful rancher who had built his empire through hard work and good fortune. He was the mastermind behind a criminal organization that had been operating with impunity for 2 decades, protected by corrupt officials and enforced by hired gunmen who thought nothing of killing anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The dying man's voice grew weaker as he described how he had watched the massacre unfold, hidden among the rocks above the narrow canyon where the surveyors had been ambushed. He had seen Whitman himself put a bullet through the head of the lead surveyor, a man named Thomas Crawford who had discovered irregularities in the land records and was returning to the territorial capital with evidence that could have destroyed Whitman and his associates. After the killing, Nailnish had waited until nightfall before descending to examine the scene, collecting items that proved white men, not Apache warriors, had committed the murders. But the most damning evidence was still hidden in the desert, buried in a location known only to Nailnish and now to his granddaughter. The surveyor's journal, containing detailed documentation of the fraudulent claims and the names of everyone involved in the conspiracy, lay wrapped in oiled cloth beneath a distinctive rock formation in the Dragoon Mountains. Along with it were military buttons from the uniforms worn by the killers, personal items they had dropped in their haste to stage the scene as an Apache attack, and most importantly, a signed confession from one of the participants who had suffered a crisis of conscience before being silenced permanently by his former associates. As the old man's breathing grew more labored, he made Jake promise to protect his granddaughter and to ensure that justice was finally done for the murdered surveyors and the Mexican families whose land had been stolen. With his final breath, he whispered the exact location of the buried evidence. Coordinates burned into Jake's memory like brands on cattle hide. Ayana's tears fell silently as her grandfather passed away, but there was steel in her voice when she turned to Jake and spoke of what must be done. The evidence had to be recovered and presented to federal authorities, men who were beyond the reach of Big Bill Whitman's influence and corruption. But first, they had to survive long enough to retrieve it, because Whitman and his associates had spent 20 years eliminating anyone who posed a threat to their empire built on blood and stolen land. Jake rode back toward town with his mind reeling from everything he had learned. The world he thought he knew had been turned upside down in the space of a few hours. The men he had respected, the wealthy ranchers whose approval he had sought, were revealed as murderers and thieves of the worst kind. Big Bill Whitman wasn't a pioneer who had tamed the wilderness through determination and courage. He was a criminal who had built his fortune on the graves of innocent people and maintained his power through intimidation and violence. As he approached the outskirts of Tombstone, Jake could see the lights blazing at the Cosmopolitan Hotel where the territorial governor's reception was still in progress. He thought of Margaret, probably wondering where he was, perhaps making excuses to her father and the other guests about his unexplained absence. She was innocent of her father's crimes, he was certain of that, but she was also the daughter of a man whose hands were stained with the blood of dozens of innocent people. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Jake rein in his horse and listen carefully to the night around him. 3 riders were coming up the trail behind him, moving fast and with purpose. In the moonlight, he could make out the shapes of men he recognized from various ranches in the area. But they weren't heading toward town for late-night entertainment. They were riding in the direction of Ayana's house, and Jake felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what was happening. Somehow, word of Nailnish's death had reached the wrong ears, and now men were being sent to silence the old man's granddaughter before she could reveal what she knew about events from 20 years ago. Jake spurred his horse into a gallop, racing across the desert terrain in a desperate attempt to reach Ayana before the killers could complete their grim mission. Behind him, the sound of pursuit grew louder as his own. Movement alerted the riders to his presence. The chase across the moonlit desert was like something from a nightmare, with Jake pushing his horse to its limits while bullets whistled through the air around him. The men pursuing him were experienced killers, comfortable with violence in a way that Jake, despite his military service during the war, found chilling in its casual brutality. These weren't soldiers fighting for a cause they believed in. They were paid murderers eliminating witnesses to protect the interests of powerful men who valued money and land more than human life. Jake reached Ayana's house just minutes ahead of his pursuers, bursting through the door to find her kneeling beside her grandfather's body, preparing him for burial according to the traditions of her people. The look of terror that crossed her face when she saw him told Jake that she understood immediately what was happening. Without wasting time on explanations, he grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the back of the house, where a narrow window opened onto the desert beyond. They escaped just as the sound of horses' hooves announced the arrival of the killers outside the front door. Jake and Ayana ran hand in hand through the darkness, stumbling over rocks and dodging between desert plants as shouts and the crash of splintering would echo behind them. The adobe house where Ayana had lived with her grandfather was being torn apart by men searching for evidence, documents, anything that might connect them to the events of 20 years ago. The fugitives made their way to a hidden canyon that Ayana knew from her childhood explorations, a narrow cleft in the rock walls where they could hide until dawn and plan their next move. As they caught their breath in the concealment of the rocky shelter, Jake told Ayanna everything he was thinking about their impossible situation. They were being hunted by men with no conscience and unlimited resources, men who had spent 2 decades perfecting their methods of silencing inconvenient witnesses. But Ayanna surprised Jake with the steel in her voice when she spoke of what they must do next. Her grandfather had spent 20 years waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth about the Surveyor massacre, and now that moment had come, regardless of the personal cost. The evidence hidden in the Dragoon Mountains represented justice not only for the murdered surveyors, but for all the Mexican families who had been killed or driven from their rightful lands by Whitman's criminal organization. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the desert around their hiding place, Jake and Ayanna made plans for what would be the most dangerous journey of their lives. The cache of evidence lay buried in a remote section of the Dragoon Mountains, accessible only through narrow trails that would leave them exposed to attack from their pursuers. But it was their only chance to gather proof that federal authorities would find impossible to ignore or suppress. What neither of them knew, as they prepared for the perilous trek through the mountains, was that their escape from the adobe house had been observed by someone else, someone whose presence in the desert that night would complicate everything they thought they understood about loyalty, betrayal, and the price of justice in the untamed territories of the American West. Margaret Whitman had left the governor's reception early, troubled by Jake's unexplained absence and determined to find out what had kept him from the most important social event of the year. She had ridden alone through the darkness, following the trail that led toward the small adobe house where she knew Jake sometimes went to meet with the Apache woman who had captured his heart. What she discovered there would force her to choose between the father who had raised her and the man she loved, between the comfortable lies of her privileged life and the terrible truth about the foundation of her family's fortune. Hidden among the rocks above the destroyed house, Margaret watched in horror as her father's men searched through the wreckage of what had been someone's home. She heard them discussing plans to track down and eliminate the half-breed girl and her Indian-loving cowboy, orders that had come directly from Big Bill Whitman himself. In that moment, Margaret realized that everything she had believed about her father's character and the source of their family's wealth had been built on a foundation of lies and blood. The revelation that followed, as Margaret confronted her father in the early hours of the morning after returning to the ranch, would expose secrets that had been festering like infected wounds for 20 years. Big Bill Whitman, faced with his daughter's accusations and evidence of his men's nighttime activities, finally told Margaret the truth about how he had built his empire and why he would stop at nothing to protect it from exposure. The Surveyor massacre had been just one incident in a long campaign of murder and theft that had made Whitman one of the most powerful men in Arizona territory. Mexican families with legitimate land grants had been systematically eliminated, their documents destroyed and their property claimed by men who understood that the territorial government was too corrupt and too distant to investigate properly. Apache tribes had been blamed for atrocities committed by white men in war paint, creating a cycle of retaliation and violence that served to drive away anyone who might have challenged the fraudulent claims. But the scheme required constant vigilance and occasional violence to maintain, because there were always witnesses, survivors, people who knew too much about events that powerful men wanted forgotten. The old Apache tracker and his granddaughter represented the greatest threat Whitman had faced in 20 years, because they possessed physical evidence that could not be explained away or attributed to the fevered imagination of disgruntled settlers. Margaret's world collapsed around her as she listened to her father describe decades of calculated brutality carried out in the name of building a legacy for his family. The money that had paid for her education back east, the beautiful dresses and fine horses that had made her the envy of every young woman in the territory, the respect and deference shown to her by everyone she met, all of it had been purchased with the blood of innocent people whose only crime was standing in the way of Big Bill Whitman's ambitions. As her father's confession continued through the long night, Margaret began to understand that Jake's choice of the Apache woman over her hadn't been a rejection of her personally. It had been an unconscious recognition of something pure and honest in Ayanna that was completely absent from the world of wealth and privilege that surrounded the Whitman family. Jake had chosen love over money, truth over comfortable lies, and now he was being hunted by killers because of that choice. When dawn broke over the Whitman ranch, Margaret made a decision that would change the course of events and determine whether justice would finally be served for the victims of her father's crimes. Instead of remaining silent and allowing the hunt for Jake and Ayanna to continue, she chose to act on information she had gained from overhearing her father's plans for tracking down the fugitives. Big Bill Whitman had anticipated that his quarry would attempt to reach the buried evidence in the Dragoon Mountains, and he had already dispatched men to patrol the most likely routes through the mountain passes. But Margaret knew of a secret trail, one that her father had used years earlier for moving stolen cattle and contraband goods, a path that could bring Jake and Ayanna to their destination without exposing them to the watching eyes of Whitman's hired killers. The race across the desert and into the mountains became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with multiple parties pursuing different objectives while the morning sun climbed higher in the clear Arizona sky. Jake and Ayanna, following Margaret's secretly delivered message about the hidden trail, made their way through terrain that was both beautiful and treacherous, always aware that discovery would mean death for both of them. Behind them, Big Bill Whitman's men spread out in a coordinated search pattern, their orders clear and simple: find the fugitives and eliminate them before they could reach the buried evidence. These weren't reluctant participants in a distasteful but necessary task. They were men who had been chosen specifically for their willingness to commit murder in service of their employer's interests. But there was another group moving through the mountains that morning, one that neither the fugitives nor their pursuers were aware of. Federal marshals, responding to an anonymous tip about criminal activity in the territory, had been conducting their own investigation into irregularities in land ownership records. The tip had come from an unexpected source: a confession left by one of Big Bill Whitman's former associates, a man who had grown tired of living with the weight of his crimes and had decided to reveal everything before taking his own life. The convergence of all these different groups in the remote canyons of the Dragoon Mountains would lead to a confrontation that would finally bring the truth about the Surveyor massacre and the fraudulent land claims to light, but not without a cost in blood that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. Jake and Ayanna reached the location described by her dying grandfather just as the sun reached its zenith in the cloudless sky. The distinctive rock formation that served as a landmark was exactly as Nailnish had described it: a towering spire of red stone that cast a precise shadow across a hidden crevice where 20 years of secrets lay buried beneath the desert floor. Working quickly with tools they had brought for the purpose, they uncovered the oiled cloth package that contained evidence of crimes that had shaped the political and economic landscape of Arizona territory. The surveyor's journal was perfectly preserved, its pages filled with detailed documentation of fraudulent land claims and the names of everyone involved in the conspiracy. Military buttons, personal items, and most damning of all, a signed confession from one of the participants in the massacre provided proof that no court in the country could ignore. But as they prepared to leave with their precious cargo, the sound of approaching horses announced that their location had been discovered. Big Bill Whitman himself appeared at the mouth of the canyon, flanked by 6 heavily armed men whose faces showed no trace of reluctance about what they had come to do. The most powerful man in Arizona territory had decided to handle this particular problem personally, ensuring that no witnesses would survive to testify about what they had found. The confrontation that followed revealed the true character of everyone involved, stripping away pretenses and social conventions to expose the essential nature of each person's moral choices. Big Bill Whitman spoke of necessity and survival, of building something lasting in a harsh land where only the strong could prosper. He offered Jake money, position, anything he wanted if he would simply walk away and forget what he had learned about events from 20 years ago. But Jake's response, delivered while standing protectively in front of Ayanna with his hand resting on his pistol, made it clear that some things were more important than survival or prosperity. The truth mattered, justice for the murdered surveyors and displaced Mexican families mattered, and love mattered more than all the gold and cattle in Arizona territory. The gunfight that erupted in the narrow canyon was brief but decisive, with federal marshals arriving just as the first shots were fired. The anonymous confession that had brought them to the territory had mentioned the location of buried evidence, and they had been moving through the mountains since dawn, following leads that had finally brought them to the exact spot where 20 years of crimes were being exposed to the harsh light of desert justice. Big Bill Whitman died with a smoking pistol in his hand and lies on his lips, still trying to convince the federal marshals that he was the victim of a conspiracy by hostile Indians and disgruntled former employees. His hired killers, faced with federal authority and overwhelming evidence of their crimes, chose surrender over a futile last stand that would have left them all dead in the desert sand. Margaret Whitman, arriving at the canyon in time to witness her father's final moments, was left to confront the ruins of everything she had believed about her family and her place in the world. The fortune that had defined her identity was revealed as stolen property that would be returned to its rightful owners, assuming any of them or their descendants could be found after 20 years of systematic elimination. The trial that followed in the territorial capital became a sensation that reached newspapers as far away as New York and San Francisco, exposing the corruption and violence that had characterized the settlement of the American West in ways that most people had never imagined. Jake Morrison's testimony, supported by Ayanna's knowledge of her grandfather's observations and the physical evidence they had recovered, painted a picture of systematic criminal activity that extended far beyond a single incident of murder and theft. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when Margaret Whitman took the stand to testify against the interests of her father's estate, confirming details about the conspiracy that only someone with intimate knowledge of the Whitman family's activities could have provided. Her decision to support the prosecution's case, despite the personal cost of destroying her own social position and financial security, demonstrated a moral courage that surprised everyone who had known her only as a pampered rancher's daughter. The aftermath of the trial saw justice finally served for the victims of the Surveyor Massacre, with the fraudulent land claims being overturned and property being returned to its rightful owners wherever possible. The corrupt territorial officials who had enabled Whitman's crimes were removed from office and prosecuted, leading to a cleaning house of the territorial government that paved the way for more honest administration of Arizona's eventual statehood. Jake Morrison and Ayanna were married in a small ceremony attended by federal marshals, reformed cowboys, and Mexican families who had recovered their ancestral lands through the exposure of Whitman's conspiracy. Their love, which had begun as a scandalous choice that violated every social convention of frontier society, became a symbol of the possibility for justice and redemption even in the harsh landscapes of the American West. Margaret Whitman, stripped of her inheritance but freed from the burden of living with her family's blood money, chose to remain in Arizona territory to work with the federal authorities in identifying other victims of her father's crimes and helping to restore stolen property to its rightful owners. Her transformation from a privileged ranch daughter to an advocate for justice represented the possibility of redemption even for those who had benefited unknowingly from criminal activity. The story of Jake Morrison's choice between the rancher's daughter and the indigenous woman became legend throughout the Southwest. But those who knew the full truth understood that it was never really about choosing between two women. It was about choosing between a world built on comfortable lies and one founded on difficult truths, between wealth acquired through violence and love earned through moral courage. Years later, when Arizona territory finally achieved statehood and the frontier began to give way to more settled civilization, old-timers would still tell the story of the cowboy who gave up everything for love and in doing so exposed crimes that had shaped the political and economic landscape of the region. They spoke of how one man's moral choice had brought justice to victims who had been forgotten for 20 years, and how love had proven stronger than greed, violence, and the corrupting influence of power. The adobe house where Ayanna had lived with her grandfather was rebuilt, becoming a gathering place for the diverse community that emerged in the wake of the trial and the restoration of stolen lands. Mexican families, Apache tribal members, reformed cowboys, and even some former associates of Big Bill Whitman who had chosen to make amends for their past actions all found common ground in their shared commitment to building a more just society on the foundations of the old territorial corruption. Jake and Ayanna raised their children to understand both their Apache heritage and the broader American culture that surrounded them, teaching them that true strength came not from dominating others but from standing up for what was right regardless of the personal cost. The lessons learned from 20 years of hidden crimes and the courage required to expose them became part of the family legacy, passed down through generations as a reminder of the price of justice and the power of moral choice. The Dragoon Mountains, where the evidence of so many crimes had been hidden for 2 decades, became a symbol of how truth could remain buried for years but would eventually emerge when people of conscience were willing to risk everything to bring it to light. The rock formation where Nailnish had hidden his grandfather's cache became a landmark for travelers, a reminder that even in the most remote and seemingly empty places, the consequences of human actions could echo through generations. And in the end, The story proved that sometimes the most important choice a person can make is not the one that brings immediate reward or social approval, but the one that aligns with their deepest values and their commitment to truth, justice, and love. Jake Morrison's rejection of the rancher's daughter and his choice of the indigenous woman had led to revelations that changed the course of history for an entire territory, demonstrating that individual moral courage could indeed make a difference in a world that often seemed dominated by greed and violence. The tale became a testament to the possibility of redemption and justice even in the harshest circumstances, and a reminder that love, when it is truly pure and selfless, can overcome even the most powerful forces of corruption and evil. In choosing Ayanna over Margaret, Jake had chosen truth over comfort, justice over wealth, and love over convenience, and in doing so had helped to build a better future for everyone who would come after them in the still wild territories of the American Southwest.